I rise today to talk about Black History Month, which has its roots with Carter G. Woodson as early as 1915 and has been officially recognized since 1976. Black History Month is an opportunity for celebration and discovery. It's time to share the successes and contributions of Black Americans that are woven deeply into the fabric of American history. Over the last year, we Marylanders made exciting history as Wes Moore became our state's 63rd governor, the first person of color to hold that office and the only currently serving Black governor in the nation. We also elected Anthony Brown, former member of the House of Representatives and a former lieutenant governor of Maryland, to be Attorney General. He, too, is the first Black to hold this position in our state. They join Adrienne Jones, the first Black and first woman to serve as Speaker of the Maryland House of Delegates, who has held that post since 2019. Nationally, the Senate made history by confirming Justice Jackson as the first Black woman to serve as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. President, we are making progress. Representation matters. When young girls and young boys of color see women and men look like them holding positions of power, it makes a real important difference in the expectations and aspirations they set for themselves. As Bernice King, the youngest daughter of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., and Chief Executive Officer of the Martin Luther King, Jr. Center for Nonviolence Change, said, "If you don't think representation matters, you're probably well represented." Representation matters in history as well. Throughout our country's history, we have seen a blatant attacks on teaching of African American history, as well as gapping omissions. Today, unfortunately, we continue to see these tactics playing out across our nation. Let me share a little of that history with you. The first Africans arrived in North America in the 16th and 17th century. A group of former Spanish slaves freed by Englishman Francis Drake arrived in California in 1579 during the first voyage to navigate the world. The first recorded group of enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. They would be the first of hundreds of thousands brought here against their will, forced into servitude in North America. In 1641, Matthias de Sousa was elected to the colonial Maryland legislature. He was the first person of African descent to hold elected office in British North America. By 1776, at the time of the American Revolutionary War, estimates are that about 20% of the population of the British colonies was of African descent. 20%. By 1788, when our Constitution was ratified, the Founding Fathers thought it appropriate that each of these men, women, and children were only counted as 3/5 of a person. After the Civil War, with the abolition of slavery, Reconstruction meant opportunities for African Americans in the South and the North, including the right to vote and be elected to office, to own land, and to participate in business. In 1870, Mississippi elected the first African American U.S. Senator, Hiram Rhodes Revels, a one-time minister and school principal in Baltimore. He was followed by Senator Blanche K. Bruce, who served in this body from 1875 to 1881. African Americans were regularly elected to Congress until 1901. From there, it would be 28 years until another Black man served in the Congress. The years between were turbulent and regressive. The summer of 1919 was dubbed Red Summer, as white-on-black violence exploded in dozens of cities across the country and continued thereafter. On May 21st, 1921, Greenwood, a prosperous Black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, became the site of one of the most violent attacks on Black freedom and progress in our nation's history. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. A white mob killed an estimated 300 people and destroyed more than 1,400 homes and businesses. Thousands of people were left homeless. Despite its severity and destructiveness, however, the Tulsa Race Massacre was barely mentioned in the history books until the late 1990s, when the state formed a commission to document the incident. Tulsa is but one example. Regrettably, there are many more instances of white mob violence that also never made it into the history books. Black history is American history, and attempts to whitewash or ignore the role of African Americans have played in this nation, even before our founding, is an immense disservice. Slavery and segregation and racism are ugly and dehumanizing, but they are part of America's history. For too long, our history lessons failed to acknowledge the African American experience and the role that African Americans have played in American history. We should all learn about the inventors like George Washington Carver, who popularized crop rotation, Henry Blair, the second African American inventor in U.S. history to be issued a patent, was born a free man in Glen Rose, Maryland in 1807. His farm machinery revolutionized planting. Garrett Morgan patented the first traffic safety signal and developed the first gas mask. We should all learn about the entrepreneurs like Madam C.J. Walker, whose hair care and cosmetic business made her the first female self-made millionaire in the United States. Robert Johnson co-founded Black Entertainment Television on the way to becoming America's first black billionaire. We should all learn about scientists like Maryland's own Benjamin Banneker, a largely self-taught mathematician, astronomer, and surveyor. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson furthered our knowledge of star and galaxy formation, and evolution has done so much as Carl Sagan to popularize science, especially astronomy. All of these individuals should take their place in our history books, along with Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Dr. King. Unfortunately, instead of expanding the teaching of black history, we're seeing a retrenchment. In Florida, we have seen one of the most brazen attacks on the teaching of African American history and culture, with the governor's rejection of the College Board's new Advanced Placement African American Studies course. For more than a year, Florida officials pressured the College Board to change its curriculum. College Board officials have since denied they capitulated, but on the first day of Black History Month, they released a revised curriculum that deleted certain topics related to black history. It appears the board was eager to keep selling its program to Florida. This past Saturday, board officials issued a statement saying, "We deeply regret not immediately denouncing the Florida Department of Education's slander, magnified by the DeSantis administration's subsequent comments that African American studies lack educational value. Our failure to raise our voice betrayed black scholars everywhere and those who have long toiled to build this remarkable field." Mr. President, Florida is not acting alone. According to the Brookings Institution, nearly 20 states have introduced legislation to ban any discussion about conscious or unconscious bias, privilege, discrimination, or oppression. At least 9 have succeeded in passing such legislation. These efforts are aimed at suppressing the discussion of uncomfortable truths about our past and even our present. They eliminate responsibility for the collective work that we all must do, not only to acknowledge the centuries of harm done to black communities, but also remedy the lasting effects of these harms. The continued suppression of history happens in many more places than schools alone, and we are all poorer for it. So much of what we have learned from generations about history, music, culture, and more have diminished or even extinguished the role of African American creators, writers, musicians, and others. We must teach our children and learn for ourselves the full breadth of the American story, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if we truly aspire to form a more perfect union. Philip Graham, the former president and publisher of the Washington Post, is credited with saying, "Journalism is the first rough draft of history." This is especially true in regards to black history. For decades, white newspapers barely acknowledged the African American communities in their readership, except when there were negative stories to tell. Brent Staples, an writer for the New York Times, recently described the culpability of white newspapers, and I quote, "Newspapers that champion white supremacy throughout the pre-civil rights South paved the way for lynching by declaring African Americans non-persons. They embraced the language once used at slave auctions by denying black citizens the courtesy of titles of Mr. and Mrs. and referring to them their stories as the Negro. End quote. 1 year ago, the Baltimore Sun declared, "We are deeply and profoundly sorry. For decades, the Baltimore Sun promoted policies that oppressed black Marylanders. We are working to make amends." The newspaper founder, Aruna S. Abel, was a Southern sympathizer who supported slavery and segregation. As the Sun editorial stated, instead of using its platform, which at the times included both a morning and evening newspaper, to question and strike down racism, the Baltimore Sun frequently employed prejudice as a tool of the times. It fed the fears and anxieties of white readers with stereotypes and caricatures that reinforced their erroneous beliefs about black Americans. Through its news coverage and editorial opinions, the Sun sharpened, preserved, and furthered the structural racism that still subjugates black Marylanders in communities today. End quote. As white newspapers perpetrated lies and negative stories, black journalism emerged to fill the void. Freedom's Journal was the first black-owned and operated newspaper. It was founded on March 16, 1827 in New York City. The newspaper's inaugural broadsheet powerful declared, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long others have spoken for us." The Maryland-based Afro-American newspaper began publishing in 1892. As the firm that owned the paper fell into bankruptcy, John H. Murphy Sr., a former slave who worked at the newspaper, borrowed $200 from his wife and purchased its equipment in 1897. In 1922, the Afro was the third largest black-owned newspaper on the East Coast behind the Chicago Defender and the Negro World. The African-American, headquartered in Baltimore, now is the oldest black business in Maryland and the longest-running African-American family-owned newspaper in the United States. John Sr.'s great-granddaughter, Dr. Frances Tony Draper, is the current publisher. This Monday, I was privileged to join Dr. Draper and other leaders from the local community to unveil a $2.2 million earmark for the Afro charities, alongside of my colleague, Senator Chris Van Hollen and Representative Kwesi Mfume. These funds will be used to preserve the archives of the African American and develop a permanent home and research center for these materials, the largest collection of this of its kind in our country. The Afro-American has been published for more than 130 years. I have seen a small fraction of these archives, and I can tell you that there is so much history that needs to be preserved for the community, the state of Maryland, and the nation. The project will be digitized. There's approximately 3 million photographs, several thousand letters, back issues of the Afro, personal audio recordings of U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and Dr. King, and so much more. Since its inception, the black press has played a critical role in the struggle for freedom for African Americans by highlighting issues that mainstream media ignored or misrepresented. As Dr. Draper of the Afro-American wrote recently, "If there was no black press, would American draft its story honestly and equitably in a way that bends, however slowly, towards justice?" We think not. The black press is America's plays a critical role shaping and preserving our community's history from the perspective of people and advocating for a better, brighter day. Today, so many black journalists continue to walk boldly in this tradition, uncovering the stories of our time with an eye towards justice and civil rights. At the forefront of these media professionals is the National Association of Black Journalists, which is headquartered at the University of Maryland, College Park. This organization was founded in 1975. It is a nonprofit association with more than 4,000 members in the United States and worldwide. The organization advocates for diversity in newsrooms, works to create strong ties among black journalists, and expand job opportunities for black media professionals. The organization provides scholarships and works with high school students to encourage black students to pursue journalism careers. Black history is America's history. Black journalism is essential to telling the American story. On March 31st, 1968, Dr. King gave his last Sunday sermon. This was one at the Washington National Cathedral. He said, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The obstacles we face are harmful and hurtful, but they are temporary stumbling blocks." On February 1st, I was proud to join my friend, Representative Mvume, in introducing the National Council on African American History and Culture Act of 2023. Our legislation would create a 12-person National Council on African American History and Culture to advise the National Endowment for the Humanities on the best ways to amplify the work of Black creators, strengthening teaching and learning in schools to ensure Black history and culture is recognized, and provide critical resources dedicated to preserving Black history. On February 7th, I was proud to invite Governor Moore to be my guest at President Biden's State of the Union address. Seated behind President Biden was Vice President Kamala Harris, a woman of color and the first female vice president. Before the State of the Union address on February 4th, the Senate curator removed the bust of former Chief Justice Roger B. Taney from the old Supreme Court chamber in the Senate wing of the Capitol building. We are making progress. The removal was in accordance with legislation I'm proud to introduce with Representative Steny Hoyer. Taney of Maryland authored the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857, ruling that African Americans could not be considered U.S. citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the U.S. territories. Our legislation directs the Joint Committee on the Libraries to commission a bust of Thurgood Marshall, another Marylander, for display in the Capitol complex, preferably near the old Senate court chamber. One justice sought to prolong slavery. The other, the first African American to sit on the nation's highest court, helped to advance civil rights in this nation due to a successful Supreme Court argument in Brown v. Board of Education, which held the doctrine of separate but equal has no place in American society. Removing the Taney bust from the old Supreme Court chamber is making the right decision about whom we choose to honor. Across the nation, monuments to enslavers are coming down. A requiem for a nun, William Faulkner, famously wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Black history is America's history. Black History Month is so important because it forces us to face who we are and where we're going. In doing so, it helps us respect and ultimately aspire to be a more perfect union. With that, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that in a separate place, comments I make concerning National Children's Dental Health Month be included in the record, and I would submit that for the record.
Without objection.
With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of quorum.